keep my eye on the chat as well, and kind of field questions that way, or definitely at the end, if you have questions, I can answer them then. So all right, so I sort of already got in a little bit of my education, the introductions, thank you for that, but just a little bit about my background, since I know I'm new to the university and have not met a lot of you. So I have my bachelor's degree in mathematics from Lehigh University, and then I got a master's degree in education from City University of New York, before transitioning into the public health field, and where I got my MHS in public mental health from Johns Hopkins, and then my PhD was in public health, and my specialty area was behavioral and community health, and that was from the University of Maryland at College Park. And I just finished in July a 2-year NIDA-funded postdoc that was housed at Penn State. So it was a T32 postdoctoral fellowship called the Prevention and Methodology Training Program. And this was duly housed in 2 research centers at Penn State, the Prevention Research Center and then the Methodology Center. So essentially it was a combination of training in statistical analysis, and then specifically of substance use data in particular. So how can we use sort of innovative statistical methods in order to analyze and better understand substance use and work towards preventing substance misuse and disorder. So I just finished that up in July before transitioning to my current position. So I'm very happy to be part of the University of Mississippi community. Been here about, I guess it's early October, moved here in July and then started in late August. So I am really glad to have joined the Department of Health, Exercise Science, and Recreation Management. And I'm right now starting to get my research lab underway. So after many failed attempts to come up with a fun acronym for my lab, could not think of one, so just settled on exactly what I do. So the Substance Use and Mental Health Research Lab is what I'm trying to kind of get off the ground this fall. And the main focus of my lab research is going to be sort of the epidemiology of substance use and looking at it through a developmental lens. And I'm very interested in how substance use changes in the young adult and emerging adult time when we see a lot of social and employment and educational milestones happening from like 18 to 35 and how substance use changes during that time. And then also how your substance use is related to your functioning during that time. So related to your academic achievement, your employment achievement, your finances, income, debt. So some of those indicators of what we consider becoming an adult. I'm very interested in how substance use is related to that. So that's just a little bit about me. So today I wanted to, instead of focusing in on like in depth on 1 or 2 studies, since this was kind of an introduction of me as a new faculty member, I wanted to really focus on a broad overview of kind of everything I have in the works right now. So that way I would be able to hopefully form some collaborations with folks and you can get a sense of all the kind of different irons in the fire that I have, and would love to see if any of that connects with any of you and sort of some potential partnerships that might be able to form. So I am going to talk about 3 studies that I had recently published over the last 2 months, because it's always really exciting when those papers come out. So I'm kind of writing that right now. And so I'm going to talk about 2 of the studies involved using multi-level modeling to better understand the within-person effects of substance use with different outcomes. And then one of them I just think is a really cool and sort of unique study that I did with some colleagues at Penn State that looked at subjective alcohol effects and language that young adults use to describe their intoxication. And then I'm just going to give a very, very brief overview of some ongoing projects and collaborations that I have with folks at different universities. And then I'm going to talk about some exciting projects that are in the works that I've been able to start to work on here at the University of Mississippi over the last month. And these are sort of in the very baby stages, baby research stages, but I'd love to share kind of what the plans for that data collection are. So that's kind of the outline that I'm going to follow. Okay. All right. So I'm going to start with the newly published research studies just to kind of give an overview of what those studies were. So the first 2 that I wanted to cover were looking at substance use at the daily and momentary level. So this was really to better understand the difference between the within and the between person relationships between substance use and different predictors or outcomes. So in the first study that just came out, we had alcohol use was treated as the predictor for this particular study. And we were interested in looking at how among college students, alcohol use was related to daily academic effort. And the purpose of this was because often in the research that we do as a community that's interested in the link between substance use and academic achievement, we often jump, if you look at this conceptual model, we often jump to the long-term outcomes. So we say that people in college or in high school who are heavy drinkers or who use other illicit drugs are more likely to delay graduation, not graduate at all. We immediately jump to those long-term outcomes. But what we forget is that there's a lot that happens in the interim before someone makes the decision to drop out of school. So from a prevention standpoint, if we were able to better look at what happens before someone gets to those long-term outcomes and intervene once we better understand those relationships, then we're going to have a much better chance at preventing some of those more detrimental long-term academic effects. So based on that, I was interested in using daily data to look at some of these intermediary processes and sort of identify what alcohol use was looking like at the daily level and not just at the large, you are a person who drinks, which makes you more at risk to have particular academic outcomes. So with that in mind, we use the multi-level modeling process, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, but essentially this is just extending linear regression to be able to account for the fact that we are collecting multiple data points from the same participant. So as opposed to giving one survey where one person answers one question, we are collecting data from one person on multiple days or throughout multiple times throughout the day. So multi-level modeling allows for us to look at not only how do we compare a person to a person, but how do we compare a person to themselves based on those time points. So this allowed me to look at data that we had from one of my colleagues at Penn State. She had run something called the University Life Study, which had a really unique analytic design. And it was a measurement burst design where she had undergraduate students take 14 daily assessments. So every day for 2 weeks, they took an assessment, and they did that for 7 semesters of college. So they would do 2 weeks their first semester, 2 weeks their second semester. So we were actually able to look at not only person versus daily data, but also semester differences as well. So it had a really interesting design that allowed for a lot of cool analysis to happen. So I was interested in looking at those daily, semester, and person level associations between not only alcohol use, but the level of alcohol use they were engaging in on a particular day and how that affected their academic behaviors the next day. So for some of the folks that we can think back to being an undergrad, if you had a particularly heavy partying night on a Thursday, your Friday academics might look a little bit different based on how you're feeling when you wake up that morning. So I was interested in comparing a moderate drinking day, so something where maybe you had 1 or 2 drinks with a friend, or went out to dinner and had a drink with dinner. I wanted to use that as my control and compare that to days where they did not drink at all, days where they engaged in heavy episodic drinking only, which typically research has looked at heavy episodic drinking as 4+, 5+ for women and men, but we're seeing trends in people drinking at double or triple that amount. So we're actually starting to move the field toward teasing out the difference between what we call heavy episodic and high intensity drinking, which is 8+ and 10+ drinks. So I did include that as a level as well. So comparing to non-drinking, heavy episodic, and then high intensity drinking days, how is that related to 2 academic outcomes? And I looked at attending or skipping class the next day, and I looked at the amount of time that they spent on schoolwork the next day. So studying, completing assignments, and also class as well. So what I found is pretty much what you would expect. And I'm just going to include our daily level findings here. So students were more likely to skip class when they engaged in heavy episodic or high intensity drinking the previous day. And we can make some assumptions about why that is, because drinking that level the previous day is going to lead to decreased sleep, lower sleep quality, hangover side effects the next day, feeling sick, physical and mental health effects. So they were more likely to just not go to class the next day after they had engaged in this heavy drinking the night before. We also split out weekdays versus weekends, because as you can imagine, you're going to have different academic habits on a weekday versus a weekend, and you're going to have different drinking habits. So we wanted to account for those potential, the confounding that could happen by putting all the days together and analyzing them together. So when we look at weekdays, exactly like what we had hypothesized, students spent more time on schoolwork when they did not drink at all the previous day. So compared to those moderate drinking days, if they did not drink, the next day they spent more time on their schoolwork. And then they spent less time on schoolwork after they engaged in heavy episodic or high intensity drinking. And we saw the same thing on weekends, that drinking that heavily the night before was going to impact how much time you spent on schoolwork. So this is essentially kind of like, you might be like, well, yeah, like, duh, like that makes sense. But what this is telling us is that we have the opportunity to not wait until someone is about to drop out of college, and we can actually start to intervene when they're starting to show some of these signs of not showing up to class, of not studying as much for a test, maybe a decrease in grades. And that's when we can start to intervene and ask if substance use might be one of those potential variables that is contributing to that decreased academic effort. So by looking at daily alcohol use as opposed to just someone's status as a drinker versus non-drinker, we can see that heavy alcohol use leads to this lower academic effort the next day, and which means that our prevention program should really be looking at not just preventing heavy alcohol use, but just looking at daily decision making. So as opposed to someone drinking heavily on a Wednesday when they have a Thursday AM class, how can we teach them to, I know it sounds weird, but to essentially save their higher drinking episodes for when they don't have those academic responsibilities. So sort of taking that harm reduction approach, considering that college students, yes, are going to engage in this behavior, but how can we work towards teaching them the daily decision making and less risky decision making when they have alternate responsibilities? So that was a study where we were able to use multi-level modeling to tease out those daily within person effects. So comparing someone's non-drinking to their own heavy drinking days. So they were acting as their own comparison group. And we just completed another study, and this actually just came out last week. So it was almost a couple days ago that it just got published, where we treated daily alcohol use as the outcome. So before we were looking as it was predicting that next day academics. And this was actually more focused on what was motivating someone to drink at the daily level. So this one was specifically focused on looking at affect and alcohol use, and this was an adult sample. And we wanted to look at differences by affective arousal, which I'll define in 1 second. So when we think about motivations for alcohol use, from a prevention standpoint, understanding why someone is drinking is very important for us to know how and when we should intervene. Because if we can know what are the contexts or situations that are going to increase someone's likelihood of engaging in a risky behavior, then we can identify when that's happening and then intervene and try to get them to decide to engage in a more healthy behavior as opposed to heavy alcohol use or substance use. So when we look at motivational models, a lot of them center around drinking for 2 reasons. Drinking to regulate your positive affect, so drinking because you want to celebrate, drinking because you're in a great mood and you want to go out with your friends, it's your birthday. And then we also see drinking to cope with negative affect. So you're feeling sad, you had a stressful day. So we sort of see that motivational models are driven by those sort of cornerstones. And when we looked at those 2 things, enhancing positive affect and coping with negative affect, we see that both of them are related to heavy alcohol use and alcohol-related problems. And typically, drinking for enhancement or social reasons, so for positive reasons essentially, is usually linked to higher quantity use, whereas drinking to cope is usually associated with alcohol-related consequences or problems. So when we were designing this study, we figured that, okay, we already know that we have these links, but this relationship between affect or mood and substance use, this might differ based on the between person, so the trait levels. So are you a more positive person than the person sitting next to you? So that would be a trait difference that just in general as a person, you are generally more positive, have higher levels of positive affect, or the state levels, which means that your mood fluctuates pretty much by the minute. So if you can compare days or moments when you have different levels of affect, so once again, acting as your own control group or your own comparison group, we can better understand the days that you might, or the moments where you might be more likely to use alcohol to enhance your mood or cope with your mood. So we wanted to kind of see, how did these relationships manifest at both the between and within person levels? But then we also wanted to look at, was there a difference by not just positive versus negative? So not just a difference by valence, but a difference by the level of arousal of that specific level of affect. So if you think about positive affect, there's a big difference between being excited because you're going out for your birthday and just being relaxed. Those are both positive affect, but one is a low positive affect of just kind of being relaxed and calm, and what is a very stimulating level of positive affect. You're very excited, and we see that with negative affect as well. There's a difference between being sad versus angry. So those are both considered negative affect, but they have different levels of arousal. So we wanted to see if that was different and how it related to alcohol use. So this specific sample, we used current adult drinkers, and they participated in an ecological momentary assessment design. So the other one was just a daily survey. This was actually, you were surveyed multiple times a day. So that was to account for the fluctuations in your mood throughout the day. So their affect was measured 7 times a day, and then their alcohol use was measured during their nighttime survey that they took, which asked about their alcohol habits. But their actual affect was measured several times a day. They would get text messages on their phone about how they were feeling at that particular moment during the day. And for this, which we thought about how we wanted to kind of actually assess and use that affect data. And we decided to create a mean level for the day, because once again, we wanted to just look at those daily associations. So we took a mean level of 4 different affect types. We looked at high arousal positive affect, so like being really excited, low arousal positive affect, so just calm or satisfied, high arousal negative affect, angry, frustrated, and then low arousal negative affect, so like being sad or depressed. So we looked at those 4 and saw whether or not there was any difference in the relationship, or whether or not there was a relationship with both just drinking at all that day and then drinking heavily that day. And what we found was actually very interesting. So we found that the only one of those 4 that was associated with alcohol use was high arousal positive affect, so like being excited. That was the only one that was actually indicative at the daily level of any type of drinking. So on a day when a participant X had higher than their usual levels of high arousal PA, so on a day where they were feeling more excited and more happy at that high level, that was associated with a 52% increase that they drank at all that day, and then 105% increase in the odds that they drank at a very high level. So we saw that positive affect and high arousal positive affect was the one that was actually linking to alcohol use. And we did not see any links with low arousal positive affect, so being relaxed or calm, low arousal negative affect, or high arousal negative affect. So kind of went against what we tend to see at the between person level, that people who drink to cope have higher levels of alcohol use. This was looking at more of those within person, and we found some different findings than we originally thought that we would. So what this kind of tells us is that positive affect should not be ignored as a motivating force for alcohol use. We often think, yes, we need to intervene when someone is feeling depressed and like they want to cope by using substances. And that is absolutely true. But we cannot ignore that people drink heavily all the time when they're in great moods. So we still need to make sure that we are taking that into account. So positive affect is one of those motivating forces at the daily level. And so how that translates then to our intervention and prevention efforts is that we need to be able to identify and help people enhance or maintain that good feeling without engaging in heavy alcohol use. So we're not telling people, hey, don't be happy because then you're going to drink a lot. We're just saying we need to come up with alternative means that you can stay at that high arousal positive affect while not engaging in this potentially risky behavior. And one of the interesting sort of intervention how we're kind of moving in the intervention field is these ecological momentary interventions. So not just are we assessing people at multiple times during the day, but we can also intervene at multiple times during the day. So if we are having, as people are taking those text message surveys, that they're in a high arousal positive affect mood, we can then maybe provide messaging in those moments, because now we know that this is linked to higher level alcohol use, that we can then use that to intervene at that moment to say, hey, instead of going out with your friends and drinking, why don't you maintain your positive affect by doing this alternate activity? So while adults are experiencing high arousal positive affect, how can we lead them to other behaviors besides engaging in heavy alcohol use? So those were kind of the two multi-level modeling studies that just recently came out that looked at both the alcohol use as the predictor and also the outcome. And then this one is sort of unrelated, but just kind of a fun one. I really enjoyed working on this study. So this was a study that just came out, once again, a couple of days ago, was looking in the heterogeneity and how people actually experience the effects of alcohol. So every person, based on both biological factors, genetic factors, personality factors, mental health, all different types of factors play into how, and people often call it tolerance. There are different words of how you actually experience alcohol as you're drinking it. Alcohol makes people feel differently. Different levels of alcohol make them feel differently. So that's why a lot of times certain measures like blood alcohol concentration don't tell us the whole story, because I could have the same alcohol concentration as you, and we might be experiencing very different things. So this study was actually looking at how adults vary and how they experience intoxication. And we were specifically looking at how they talk about it. So oftentimes when we're creating assessments, we choose the words that we give participants for how alcohol makes them feel. So we wanted to kind of explore what language people used to talk about how they were feeling when they were drinking. So these subjective feelings a lot of times can be better indicators of risky decision-making or alcohol-related consequences as opposed to something like BAC. And we've seen that in instances of, say, driving while intoxicated, that people's decisions to get in a car and drive maybe home from the bar are often not, they're not blowing into a breathalyzer and checking their BAC. They're saying, how drunk do I feel? And then deciding from then whether or not they're okay to drive. So we need to understand how that subjective effect is working so that we can intervene before someone actually decides to engage in a risky behavior. So typically when we're trying to measure this, like how drunk do you feel is the question people ask. And it's like 0 to 100. It's like a sliding scale. And this is typically how we assess it. And it's not great because it limits our understanding of really the full range of subjective effects that a person can feel. And also we are using one word. We use the word drunk all the time. And if we think just in your own life, you think about the different words that you use or that people use to describe different levels of intoxication, it is very, very varied, very, very varied. It is very varied. And some sources have found over 900 terms for how people will describe intoxication. If you look up synonyms for drunk, there's a lot of them, like wasted, tipsy, all these words, and then some that you've just never even heard of. And a lot of them are based on culture. A lot of them are based on geographic location, generation, gender or sex differences, and how people talk about how they're feeling. And drunk means different things to other people. I might not identify as being drunk until I've reached a certain level of intoxication or a certain level of sort of symptomatic or physical effects, whereas someone else who maybe is not a particularly heavy drinker or is different in all those characteristics I mentioned before, is going to say they might be drunk after one drink. So then how can we then use that word to assess how someone is intoxicated if it means so many different things to so many different people? So we were really interested then to look at what words people use. So this was really a study that was focused on language. And so we had 323 young adults. They were about 18 to 25. And we essentially just had them self-generate words for different levels of intoxication. So we said, if you've drank a little bit, maybe 1 or 2 drinks, what are the words that you would describe how you feel? So maybe someone might say buzzed or tipsy or nothing or sober. So they gave us a list, and we did, just so that the wording wouldn't get too crazy, we did limit the amount of terms that they could give us, so it was a manageable task. And we would ask the same thing for a moderate and then a heavy drinking episode to just sort of generate words that they used. And what we wanted to do was actually use a latent class analysis to put young adults in different classes or subgroups based on the words that they used, because we assumed that individuals who use similar language also might have similar drinking patterns or drinking behavior. So we first wanted to do that latent class analysis to take the words people had generated and then sort of put them in those groups and then see if that predicted what their typical drinking patterns were. So was language indicative of behavior? And so after the latent class analysis, the best fitting model that we identified was 4 latent classes, and this was based on the probability of them using certain words. So if you had a higher probability of identifying particular words, you were placed in a particular subgroup. So the first, and we named these, and it was actually really hard to name them because the words were kind of varied, but the first group we called happy drinkers. That was about 31%. The term happy was what they used for most of their drinking experiences. They just said when they were drinking, they felt happy. That was the word they used. How are you feeling? Happy. Then we had 24% fell into relaxed drinkers. That also included people who frequently used happy, but they also used the terms relaxed, buzzed. So we called these our relaxed drinkers. They were just kind of, hanging out, feeling buzzed, and that was about a quarter of the sample. Then we had what we called buzz drinkers, who started to get into the more physiological effects. So they said buzz, but they also said they would feel dizzy. So these were like the highest probability words, especially as they got up into the heavier drinking episodes, that they felt dizzy and buzzed. And then we had people that literally were kind of all over the place. They used a ton of different words to describe it, and it was incredibly varied, and that was also about a quarter of the sample. So they used tipsy, buzzed, drunk, wasted, and these were ones that they used and kind of ran the gamut of different terms that we might use. So we then wanted to see how these 4 different latent classes actually predicted substance use behavior. So once again, the results were not really what we were expecting, but we were able to kind of hypothesize why we found particular groups and relationships. So what we found when we looked at drinking quantity was that the relaxed drinkers actually had the highest drinking quantity as compared to all other classes. So those people who, once again, were identified as happy, relaxed, buzzed, they were actually drinking the heaviest. And so what we sort of looked at is actually going back to what I had talked about with affect. If you use language like happy, like buzzed, like relaxed, sort of that positive reinforcement, we just saw that is linked in our prior study, that is linked to heavier drinking patterns and higher quantity patterns. And also the word relax can also be a coping mechanism as well. So going back to that coping with negative affect, which we've seen in motivational models, that word relax may explain that link of why we're seeing higher quantity alcohol use among this group. And then this was also interesting too, is that group that often used wasted, tipsy, and some of those more sort of that multi-experience and really varied language, they actually had lower frequency. And the first thing that I remember saying to my team is I was like, that doesn't make sense, because these seems like these would be the people who are the heaviest drinkers. So we looked back and they were actually, and they were second in the highest quantity group, and that they were, yes, they were low frequency, so they weren't drinking on a lot of days, but on the days they were drinking, they were binge drinking. So this was a group that was drinking infrequently, but they were drinking with the intention to get drunk. So as opposed to drinking 1 or 2 glasses of wine a day, they were going out on maybe just a Friday or a Saturday, but they were really heavily drinking. So that's why we're getting those words like wasted and other words that typically describe heavier drinking episodes from this group. So we really saw a lot of interesting words emerge and come out. And the original list we had was like really cool to look at. And there is a different paper that was published specifically just on the language that came out. But young adult users, we can actually distinguish them and their behavior from the words that they use to describe their feelings of intoxication. And so as we continue to study subjective effects, we shouldn't just stick to those assessment measures, just how drunk are you feeling? We should take into account that different people use different words, and that we need to use we have to have a better representation in our assessments of that full range of language, especially since it will identify drinking behavior. So if we can use language as a means of identifying people that are at high risk for heavy drinking, that's kind of a unique prevention or intervention angle. So this was just a really cool study to work on. We called the study Buzzwords, which is very creative because like buzzword, right? It's fun. So that took longer than I think the analysis did to come up with the study name, but worth it. So so it was a really interesting study to really just look more directly at language and how important it is when you're studying something like substance use. So those were the three main studies that just came out that I wanted to highlight because I was, it's always exciting when your research finally comes out. And for the next couple slides, I just want to kind of very briefly touch on several ongoing studies that I have, because once again, I want to kind of give you a sense of all the different things that I'm interested in and working on, so that if there's any potential for collaborations, you can always let me know. So I have a couple ongoing projects and collaborations that I wanted to highlight from different universities. So because I think they're really interesting projects, and most of these are in the analytics stage right now. So one of them, so I got my PhD at the University of Maryland, and I've been able to maintain a working relationship with them. And one of the things I worked on when I was in my PhD program was a study called the College Life Study. And this is a great source of data. It's an ongoing longitudinal study of college students who were assessed annually from ages 18, and actually, I think they're even older than 31 now. They started collecting this data in 2004, and it's still going on. So these people are now in their 30s, and it's always interesting to collect data from them every year, because when we call or email them, they're like, I cannot believe you guys are still asking me about my substance use. They're like, I'm 35 years old and you're still, and it's like, yeah, that's great. Like, can you tell me about your drug use? So we're, it's a really neat study because we have it from when they were young, and we're able to see what they did in college and how that's actually affected or indicated or predicted sort of a lot of how their life has played out. So it's a really cool study and a really rich data set. So one of the studies that I'm working on now, and one of the techniques that I learned when I was in my postdoc at Penn State, was looking at how associations change over time. A lot of our analysis and our regular regression analyses are only allowing you to look at an effect over at one period of time, but we can imagine that effects are going to change with age, that how your substance use is related to your mental health is going to be different at 18 versus 30. So when we have longitudinal analysis, we can use time varying effect modeling to look at how effects can be modeled across time. So I'm using that model right now and College Life Study data to look at age varying associations between alcohol use and what I kind of coined it economic functioning. So I wanted to look at the post-college period, so about 22 to 34, and I wanted to look at each year how the association between alcohol use and whether or not someone was employed, their financial independence from their parents, their income, and sort of different indicators of, once again, like what you might consider adulthood to be. I wanted to look how that changed. So was your alcohol use more linked to being employed or unemployed at 23 than it is when you're 31? Because if we just kind of put all that data together, we're not getting the full picture of how it might shift at different developmental points. So that's something I'm still working on with my colleagues at the University of Maryland. I also still have some projects that I started at Penn State that I've carried over. One is actually, so even though my dissertation data was collected at Maryland, I'm working with my Penn State colleagues to analyze my dissertation data using, once again, that sort of time varying model. So my dissertation research, I'm very interested in academic achievement and how it relates to mental health and substance use. And there's a huge dearth of literature on graduate students and graduate student substance use and graduate student mental health. We do a lot of research on undergraduate students, and I think a lot of times we tend to ignore graduate student mental health. So I did for my dissertation an assessment of master's and doctoral students, and I measured their mental health and their substance use and different program characteristics. So their advisor satisfaction, their sleep, their faculty support, sort of different indicators of graduate student well-being. So for this particular study, I'm once again using that time varying model to look at throughout the duration of a PhD program, how is the relationship between your mental health and your substance use going to change from your first semester to your last. So I'm able to use students at different points in their PhD program. It ranged from they're in their first semester to in their 16th semester, depending on what they were, what field they were in. We have a lot of people, their PhD extends into 6, 7, 8 years. I wanted to be able to look at, yes, your mental health is typically related to your substance use, but does that change? Is there more of a link? And is there a stronger or higher magnitude link when you first get there and versus when you're finishing? And so I want to be able to once again use that time varying model with my time variable being length in your program and see how the association between mental health and substance use changes across that PhD program. So that's something that, once again, these are all in the analytics stage and hoping to be able to write those up and get them published soon. And the last one that I wanted to highlight was a collaboration that I have with the University of Washington. They have a really unique data set there called Project Transitions. And essentially, this is looking at some of those big social and economic transitions that I mentioned that occur during young adulthood. So this is a period when a lot of people are getting married, becoming employed, going to college, graduating college, having children. So these are major life transitions. And a lot of work has already looked at substance use and how it relates before and after and how it changes before and after those changes. But there's often a lot of things that happen besides just those major developmental changes. So like if you think about a relationship, we already know that substance use tends to decline after people get married. But there are a lot of other types of what this study has deemed micro transitions that happen in relationships that are not just getting married. So it might be moving in with a partner. It might be giving them a small drawer in your house. These are all different transitions that happen in relationships that might also be related to your substance use. So this project looked at those smaller micro transitions as opposed to just those big, more like life-changing transitions. And so I was really interested in, once again, my interest in sort of employment and work. I wanted to look at those smaller work-related transitions. So this was a longitudinal study that measured these micro transitions among young adults. And I didn't want to just look at, are you employed and are you not employed? Because that's not just getting fired or getting laid off is not the only change that we see that happens when someone's in someone's job. So I want to look at the changes, the smaller work changes. So maybe you got a promotion, maybe your work title changed, your pay went up or your pay went down, your schedule changed, your work responsibilities changed. Some of these smaller micro transitions that happen, and how, and does that affect alcohol use behavior? And it might not. It might just be that the big, I got fired or laid off is the only thing that's related. But I want to look at how these smaller work changes, if that has an influence on your substance use behavior or is associated at all. And also, does your perception of it being positive or negative, because a change in work title could be a good thing or a bad thing. And then also how much stress is associated with that as well, because a positive change can still be stressful. So kind of looking at the moderating differences there, but in that data set. So I know I do want to leave time for questions, so I'm kind of winding down here, but I wanted to highlight some of the exciting things that are coming up for me and that I've been working on some folks here at the University of Mississippi with. So these are, once again, the data has not been collected, but we have some upcoming data collection. So the first one is a study with several people that are on this call that I think will be really neat. So substance use is, our research right now kind of has this asterisk by it because we're in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic. So any data that we collect right now, we're going to kind of have to mention that as a potential limitation unless we are actually looking at COVID-19 as a moderating factor, a predictor, or an outcome. So a lot of the work that I'm doing now is, instead of being like, oh, well, we can't collect any data, how can we capitalize on sort of this situation that we're in and look at it in a way that could predict how substance use has been affected or had been an indirect effect of what's been happening in this sort of public health crisis that we're in. So these 3 studies are all related to substance use and COVID-19. So the first one, which I'm working on with Dr. Allison Ford-Wade, Samantha Cohn-Wines, and Kaylin Armstrong, is looking at substance use and COVID-19 status and behaviors among undergraduate students here at the University of Mississippi. So we are actually going to send next week, so we finally just got our IRB approval yesterday, so really exciting. We're going to send a survey to a panel of 5,000 undergraduate students here, specifically wanting to look at their substance use. So we're going to collect data on tobacco, alcohol, and other drug use. And then we're going to collect data on not only have you had COVID-19, so your COVID-19 status, but the severity of your symptoms, were you exposed and had to quarantine, your attitudes towards the pandemic and towards COVID-19, and how you're adhering to both campus and local and state guidelines. So the reason why we kind of hypothesize that there is a link, we believe that there might be a direct link between substance use and COVID-19 risk, because particular types of substance use like tobacco use or marijuana use or other inhaled drugs can put you at increased risk to get a respiratory infection. So there might be that direct effect. But we also believe that there might be some indirect effects because substance use is putting you in particular contexts that might increase your risk. So we're collecting data not only on your substance use, but also on your motivating factors. So are they social? And then the context. So are you drinking in large peer groups? Are you using cannabis in peer groups? Because that might be the reason why we see a link, is because you are putting yourself in a situation that is increasing your risk by being around other people. And particularly for college students, they don't tend to sit in their dorm and drink alone. So we're anticipating that for this particular population, we're going to see a link between alcohol use and COVID-19 because of that contextual factor that they are drinking in groups and around other people. They are smoking marijuana with other people. They might be sharing pipes, sharing bongs, other things that are going to increase their risk. So we're launching that next week, and we're hoping to get that data published quickly so that we can sort of see these relationships that are happening. The other thing that I'm also looking is, so not only am I interested in these student populations, but I have a big interest in how this pandemic has affected alcohol use among employed workers. So I'm also now designing the assessment. So this is in even the earlier stages. I'm designing this assessment with a colleague of mine at Penn State, so Dr. Jones, and then my graduate assistant, Nash. We are looking at alcohol use and work productivity, specifically among people who are working at home. So I'm interested in using a daily diary study. So I would like to look at their daily substance use and work behaviors. And I want to focus on people that are specifically working from home, because we've seen a lot of news articles and preliminary research data that alcohol use has increased, specifically because people are at home and bored, and they're turning to alcohol use to kind of cope with the stresses of the pandemic and cope with boredom that is happening in quarantine. So when I think about people working from home, my interest is remote work causing work-related stress that is going to maybe predict heavy alcohol use? Are people drinking while they're on the job because they can actually do that at home as opposed to what they could do in the office? So I want to kind of just look at the quantity, frequency, and context of alcohol use among people working at home. And then how is that related to both their same-day work stress, productivity, and engagement, and also those same factors the next day? And does this differ by not only their demographic, but maybe their work characteristics as well? So different types of companies, people working in different types of fields. So really understanding what those relationships might look like. So once again, I'm just designing this assessment now, and then hoping to get that approved. And I would like to be able to collect that data before the holidays, so that once again, we can sort of capture the unique situation that's happening right now among remote work and just sort of during the pandemic. And the last thing I want to talk about before I get into questions is something that is very much outside of my typical work. As you've noticed, I've done mostly social and behavioral work in my career, but I'm always interested in learning other means of understanding substance use. So I recently was approached by someone who works in civil engineering here at the University of Mississippi, so Dr. Matteo D'Alessio, and he is interested in actually tracking both substance use and COVID-19 in wastewater on campus. So this is not new. So I know that there's really cool research that has come out of the University of Mississippi in the past that has actually analyzed water runoff and wastewater to look at substance use after tailgating and other large social events. But he had this really unique idea to actually be able to track trends in substance use and COVID-19 across time on campus. So at the University of Mississippi campus, we have wastewater treatment plants that are linked to different residence halls and just the campus in general. And there is a means of being able to track substance use by looking at the breakdown of that wastewater, and then also being able to track COVID-19 and being able to map those. So sort of my hypothesis from earlier studies that there's that relationship that we can not only sort of track and outline our changes in substance use actually aligning with changes in COVID-19, but at the same time, and this is kind of where because when he originally reached out to me, I was like, I don't work in chemistry. I don't collect wastewater. Like, I don't even know why you would need me for this. But he essentially was like, I think that we should look at self-reported behavioral data and then compare that or contrast it to what we find in the wastewater. So we can ask people about their substance use and ask people about their COVID-19 status, and then see if that compares to the prevalence that we're able to detect by looking at wastewater on campus. So he got a seed grant earlier in the summer to start collecting samples from wastewater treatment plants on campus. So he has already been doing that. And he wants to sort of add in this substance use piece by being able to track the levels of ethyl sulfate, which would be able to detect, and we could come up with prevalence estimates for alcohol use, but then also the main metabolites of other substances. So essentially any drug or substance, you can break it down chemically and see if you can detect those chemicals in the water. And you can also, which has been an emerging area of research over the last 6 months, is you can track the presence of SARS-CoV-2, which is the virus that causes COVID-19. You can track that in wastewater as well. So if we're able to not only look at substance use, but also COVID-19, we can once again overlay the patterns we find in wastewater and then compare that to what we would find in self-reported behavioral data of what's happening on campus. So this is once again something him and I have talked about briefly. We're going to look into some potential grant funding mechanisms that we could possibly get to be able to do this work, and he has already started this, but I do think it's a really cool thing. I wanted to highlight that work that he's doing, and hopefully something I can contribute to on kind of the behavioral social side. So I know that was a lot at the end, but once again, I kind of wanted to give you an overview of the different areas I'm interested in, and what I've been working on, and what I'm still working on and hoping to start here. So I do want to acknowledge for the 3 studies that I highlighted, I had really great collaborators at both Penn State and the University of Maryland, as well as the research centers at Penn State. All of this was funded by NIDA and NIAAA grants, as well as Biobehavioral Health Department at Penn State funded the research that I talked about in terms of the published studies. So I always want to recognize that none of this work happens alone. I really appreciate this. I know this, once again, I'm a very long-winded person, so I know I talked a lot, and I think we have about 10 minutes for questions, but that's my contact information. As I'm new to the university, always interested in hearing about other people doing substance use work and potential collaborations, and then also follow me on Twitter because I love getting new Twitter followers. So, all right, that's it. So I can definitely take 10 minutes worth of questions if we have them.
Thank you so much for presenting. This was a great presentation. Before we take questions, I wanted to point you to the questionnaire for this presentation. You can find the link in the chat, and you can click and enter your input, please. Thank you.
And I can also stop sharing my screen so I can kind of see folks as well. You can also feel free to type questions in the chat, or I can just take them verbally as well. Or if there are none, that's fine too.
Well, great presentation, Hannah. That was great. I enjoyed it. She's from my department. Well,
Yeah.
I think is the studies that you did for the 1, 2, and 3 that has a good application of statistical analysis, like mixed effect modeling and latent class of modeling into the questions that you asked. So I think that you had a good team to share your ideas, but at the same time analyze the right statistical analysis to answer your question. So I really enjoyed that. Some of your future study that you mentioned about collecting 5,000 students at Ole Miss with their behavior related to the substance usage. I think that something that you can think about as a physical activity level, some kind of weight changes as well. That might have been something to do with their substance use and also their micro behavior changes. So I just wanted to throw these things out at you so when you plan for the study. Good job.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, I think there's been so many health behaviors that have changed at this time, and definitely physical activity is one of them. Substance use for sure, mental health, just overall health behavior has shifted a lot since February, March. So yeah, I think that's great. Any other questions? Or we can also finish up and people can have 5 minutes of their day back too. So
yeah, great job, Hannah. Really pleased and impressed with your presentation, and definitely see a lot of overlap. If you hadn't been introduced to me yet, I'm the department chair in criminal justice and legal studies. And so obviously we have a lot of folks over here that do research in the substance abuse area as well. So I see a lot of potential for overlap and collaboration with some of my faculty as well.
yeah, that's great to hear. Yeah, I kind of have a running Word document on my computer where I'm trying to get a sense of folks on campus doing substance use work. And I think there's pockets all over the campus. So definitely interested in getting to connect with people that are doing this across different disciplines.
Yeah, so welcome to Ole Miss.
Thank you. Thanks.
It might make sense to form a group of substance abuse in School of Applied Sciences, because we have few people, or more than few people, who are working on substance abuse. So let me figure out what we can do to get people together to have a collaboration or potential collaboration.
I think that would be great. I think some type of like substance use working group would be fantastic. And I would definitely be interested in that. So I think it'd be great if we could set that up.
Let's do it.
Sounds great.
All right. Well, thank you so much for presenting. We are having the next presentation in 2 weeks, I believe. It will be October 21st by Dr. Greenspan at the same time. I think it's going to be the same link that time. So we will see each other in 2 weeks. Thank you very much. And don't forget the survey, please.
Thanks.
Thank you, Hannah, but thank you also, Hot Tassi, for organizing.
Thank you too.